Poor Waitress married a 72-year-old millionaire. 10 days later she was shocked by his will. The aroma of coffee and freshly baked pastries filled the air as Rachel wiped her hands on her apron, unaware of the man who had just entered her small cafe. Wearing a sharp suit and a determined expression, he hesitated briefly before approaching the counter. "Excuse me, are you Rachel Miller?" he asked, his voice deep and commanding. Rachel turned, startled by his presence and the intensity in his eyes. "Yes, I am," she replied cautiously, wondering who this stranger was and what he wanted. He looked at her for a moment, as if weighing his next words carefully. "I'm Thomas Reed," he said, extending his hand. "I have an offer that will change your life forever." Rachel's heart skipped a beat. She had no idea that the next 10 days would bring a whirlwind of emotions, secrets, and revelations that would leave her questioning everything she thought she knew, not just about Thomas, but about herself. The man she had just met was about to turn her world upside down in ways she never could have imagined. Rachel Miller had spent most of her 27 years navigating life's curveballs. A waitress at a quaint downtown cafe, she worked long hours to make ends meet. Her days were an endless cycle of refilling coffee cups and juggling plates while her evenings were spent poring over bills she could barely afford to pay. Life in her small-town apartment was modest but far from easy. She had dreams once, dreams of becoming a chef and owning her restaurant. But those aspirations had been shelved years ago when her mother's illness drained the family's savings and left Rachel shouldering the burden of debt. Now, she lived day to day, her goals reduced to ensure the lights stayed on and her rent was paid. Despite her struggles, Rachel had an innate warmth that made her beloved by her regulars. She greeted every customer with a smile, even on her hardest days. The cafe owner, Sam, treated her like family, often slipping her extra shifts or small bonuses when business was good. But the town's recent economic downturn had taken its toll. Customers were fewer, tips were smaller, and Rachel's financial worries grew heavier with each passing week. Deep down, she wondered if she'd ever escape the cycle of barely scraping by. That's when Thomas Reed walked into her life. He wasn't the type of customer Rachel usually served. Impeccably dressed and exuding confidence, Thomas looked like he belonged in a boardroom, not in her modest cafe. Their brief interaction lingered in her mind all day. He'd asked questions about her life, probing ones that seemed too personal for a stranger. Yet something was intriguing about his intensity. Rachel didn't know it then, but Thomas wasn't there for the coffee. He had a proposition that would thrust her into a world she never imagined. A world where wealth and secrets intertwined, and where her life would never be the same. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cafe as Rachel wiped down the counter, preparing for the quiet lull before the evening rush. The bell above the door jingled, signaling a new customer. She glanced up, expecting one of her regulars, but instead, Thomas Reed walked in again, his tailored suit sharply contrasting the cafe's humble interior. "Rachel," he said, his voice smooth yet commanding. "Do you have a moment to talk?" She hesitated, unsure of what to make of his return. "I'm working, but," her curiosity won out, and she gestured toward a booth. 5 minutes. Thomas slid into the booth and waited for her to sit across from him. His piercing gaze made her feel like he was studying her, assessing something she couldn't quite place. Finally, he broke the silence. "I need someone I can trust. Someone unconnected to my world," he began, folding his hands on the table. "And I think that someone might be you." Rachel frowned, confused. "Trust? For what? You don't even know me." He leaned in slightly, his tone dropping to a near whisper. "I know enough. I know you're hardworking, resilient, and, most importantly, you need an opportunity." She stiffened at the accuracy of his words. "What are you getting at?" Thomas reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick envelope, placing it on the table between them. "Inside this envelope is a contract," he said. "All I'm asking is for you to listen to my proposal before making any decisions." Rachel eyed the envelope warily, her instincts telling her to walk away. What kind of proposal? Thomas leaned back, his expression unreadable. I'll be blunt. I'm a wealthy man with certain obligations. For reasons I'll explain if you agree, I need to marry, and quickly. This isn't about love or romance. It's a mutually beneficial arrangement. You'll have financial security beyond anything you've ever imagined. Her breath caught, the sheer audacity of his words leaving her momentarily speechless. You want me to marry you? She finally managed, her voice tinged with disbelief. Yes, he said plainly. You'll receive a substantial sum of money up front, and an ongoing allowance. In return, you'll accompany me as my wife for a specified period. Afterward, you'll be free to walk away with enough to change your life. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest. Was this some sort of twisted joke? She glanced at the envelope, her mind racing. She'd spent years struggling, sacrificing her dreams for survival. The prospect of financial freedom was tempting, but at what cost? Why me? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Thomas's gaze softened, just slightly. Because you're exactly the kind of person who deserves a chance. And because, Rachel, I think you're the only one I can trust to keep this arrangement strictly professional. The cafe felt too small, too stifling. Rachel stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. I need time to think about this, she said, her voice shaking. Thomas nodded, sliding the envelope closer to her. Take all the time you need. But remember, this opportunity won't wait forever. As Rachel walked back to the counter, the weight of the envelope in her hand felt heavier than it should. Little did she know, her decision would set into motion a chain of events that would change everything. Rachel spent the rest of her shift in a daze, her thoughts consumed by the envelope Thomas had left on the counter. As she scrubbed tables and refilled coffee cups, her mind replayed their conversation on an endless loop. His words were absurd, but they carried an undeniable allure. What would it feel like to finally escape the financial strain that had ruled her life for so long? Still, a proposal like his couldn't come without strings attached, and she couldn't help but question the true cost. That night, Rachel sat at her tiny kitchen table, the envelope resting in front of her like a ticking bomb. She stared at it for what felt like hours before finally breaking the seal. The contract inside was as detailed as it was overwhelming. Legal jargon filled every page, outlining the terms of their arrangement, a 6-month marriage, a monthly allowance that dwarfed her annual income, and a lump sum payment upon its conclusion. The next morning, Rachel arrived at the cafe determined to return the envelope and put the entire ordeal behind her. But as she approached the door, she found Thomas already there, leaning casually against his car, waiting. Good morning, he said smoothly, his tone unreadable. Have you given it any thought? This is insane, Rachel stammered. You can't just ask someone to marry you like it's a business deal. Thomas's expression didn't falter. Why not? Marriage is often a transaction, Rachel. People marry for convenience, power, and financial gain. This isn't so different. She hesitated, her resolve faltering under his piercing gaze. But why me? Why not someone from your world? Because, he said, stepping closer, people in my world have motives. They see my wealth and my name, and they want something more. You're honest. You don't have ulterior motives, and that's exactly why I chose you. Rachel's heart raced. She wanted to reject him outright, but the desperation in his voice felt genuine. Against her better judgment, she found herself asking, what's so important that you need to do this? For the first time, Thomas's confident facade cracked. He glanced away, his jaw tightening. Let's just say my family's legacy is at stake, and I can't afford to lose control. This arrangement ensures that I keep what's mine. The way he said it left little room for further probing. After a long silence, Rachel sighed. I'll think about it. Thomas's lips curved into a small, almost triumphant smile. Take your time. But remember, the clock is ticking. Over the next few days, Rachel wrestled with the decision. Every time she thought about walking away, the weight of her unpaid bills and mounting debts pulled her back. Sam, the cafe owner, noticed her distraction. "Everything okay, kid?" he asked one evening as they closed up. "Yeah," she lied, forcing a smile. "Just, a lot on my mind." "Well, whatever it is, don't let it eat you up," Sam said kindly. "You're tougher than you think." His words stayed with her as she lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling. Maybe she was tough, but was she tough enough to take on something as bizarre as Thomas's proposal? The following week, Rachel called Thomas. "I'll do it," she said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside her. The whirlwind began immediately. Thomas arranged for her to move into his sprawling estate, a place so grand it felt like stepping into another world. Marble floors gleamed under chandeliers that probably cost more than her entire apartment. She was given a new wardrobe, complete with designer dresses and shoes she'd only seen in magazines. Thomas introduced her to his lawyer, who went over the contract in excruciating detail, ensuring every clause was understood. "This is strictly business," he reminded her, his tone professional. "You're expected to attend events, present yourselves as a couple, and avoid drawing unnecessary attention." Rachel nodded, though the weight of it all felt crushing. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was playing a part in a production she barely understood. Their first public appearance as a couple was at a charity gala. Rachel had never felt more out of place. The room was filled with people who spoke in clipped, polished tones, their laughter cold and calculated. Thomas stayed close, guiding her through conversations and introducing her as "my fiancée." At one point, an older woman with a piercing gaze approached them. "Thomas, darling, who is this lovely creature?" she asked, her tone dripping with curiosity. "This is Rachel," Thomas said smoothly. "She's very special to me." Rachel forced a smile, but the woman's eyes lingered on her a moment too long as if dissecting her every flaw. As the night wore on, Rachel's discomfort grew. "Do you think I belong here?" she whispered to Thomas during a quiet moment. He looked at her, his expression softening. "You're doing fine, Rachel. Better than fine." But his reassurance did little to ease her unease. The world Thomas lived in was foreign and intimidating, filled with unspoken rules she didn't know how to follow. Still, she reminded herself why she was there: financial freedom, a chance to build a life she'd only dreamed of. As weeks turned into months, Rachel began to adapt. She learned how to navigate high society events, mastering the art of small talk and polite smiles. Despite her initial reservations, she and Thomas developed an unexpected rhythm. They shared quiet breakfasts in the estate's sunlit kitchen and exchanged stories about their vastly different upbringings. But just as Rachel began to feel a sense of stability, cracks in Thomas's carefully constructed world started to show. Late one night, she overheard a heated phone call in his study. His voice was low but tense. "I don't care what it takes," he said. "Make sure this doesn't fall apart." When he emerged, his face was tight with worry. "Everything okay?" she asked cautiously. He hesitated before offering a strained smile. "Just business. Nothing for you to worry about." But Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Thomas's arrangement than he was letting on. And as their 6-month deadline loomed closer, she began to wonder if she'd made a deal with a man who was as trapped as she was. The grand estate was eerily quiet as Rachel made her way down the marble-floored corridor, the envelope clutched tightly in her hand. It had been slipped under her door late that evening, a single word scrawled across it: truth. Her heart pounded as she opened it, her eyes scanning the contents: a series of documents, photographs, and an anonymous note that read, "You deserve to know." The photos showed Thomas at meetings with men who exuded power and menace, their faces grim and their handshakes filled with unspoken promises. The documents detailed complex financial transactions, some of which suggested his family's empire was built on dubious dealings. But it was the final page that shook her to the core, an email from Thomas himself, sent just weeks before their agreement, outlining his desperate plan to marry someone unrelated to his world to secure his family's assets. Her chest tightened as the realization set in. She wasn't chosen because she was special or trustworthy. She was chosen because she was convenient, a pawn in a game far larger than she could comprehend. Betrayal surged through her veins, turning her hands cold. Just as she was about to storm out of the room, the door to Thomas's study creaked open, and his voice called out, "Rachel, is that you?" She froze, the envelope still in her grasp. Gathering her courage, she stepped inside. Thomas was seated at his desk, his tie loosened and his hair disheveled. The sight of him, vulnerable and unguarded, would have softened her resolve before. Now, it only fueled her anger. "Care to explain this?" she said, slamming the envelope onto his desk. The sound echoed in the room, startling him. Thomas's eyes flicked to the contents, his expression shifting from surprise to dread. He reached for the documents, but Rachel slapped her hand over them, her voice shaking. "Don't even try to deny it. I read everything." He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "Rachel, it's not what you think." "Don't you dare," she interrupted, her voice cracking. "You made me believe I was here because you trusted me because I was different. But I was just a tool to you, wasn't I?" Thomas stood, his chair scraping against the floor. "It started that way," he admitted, his voice low. "But it's not like that anymore. Rachel, please, you have to believe me. Things changed." She shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. "Changed? When? When did I stop being just a convenient solution and start being someone who mattered? Because you certainly never told me." He stepped closer, his hands outstretched as if to calm her. "Rachel, I know I've lied to you, and I can't undo that. But what I feel for you now is real. These past few months, they've shown me that I need more than just someone to fill a role. I need you." Her voice wavered with a mix of anger and sorrow. "And how am I supposed to believe that? How do I know this isn't just another manipulation?" Thomas's shoulders slumped. "I don't know how to prove it," he said quietly. "But if you walk away right now, I won't stop you. I won't blame you. Just know that I never meant to hurt you." Rachel's grip on the documents loosened, and they fluttered onto the desk. She stared at him, searching his face for any sign of deceit, but all she saw was regret, and something that might have been love. Without a word, she turned and left the room, her steps echoing in the empty hallway. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew one thing: nothing would ever be the same. The morning air was crisp as Rachel sat on the edge of the small pond behind her childhood home. She had returned to the quiet familiarity of her parents' house to reflect, needing distance from the chaos Thomas's world had unleashed. The envelope lay unopened beside her, but its weight was less tangible than the decision it represented. The betrayal had been raw, yet the sincerity in Thomas's voice the night she confronted him lingered in her mind. A week had passed since she walked out of his study. She had expected Thomas to call, to send someone, or to try and pull her back into his world. But he hadn't. The silence was both a relief and a source of anxiety. It gave her time to think, but it also left her questioning whether she had misjudged him. When her phone finally buzzed that evening, she wasn't surprised to see his name. What did surprise her was the message: "I'm sorry. Take all the time you need." For days, she tried to make sense of her emotions. On the one hand, she felt used, and deceived by a man who had treated her as a pawn. On the other, she couldn't deny that Thomas had shown her glimpses of vulnerability, moments where his guard had fallen, and he seemed like a man desperate to be more than his wealth and legacy. But was that enough? Rachel decided to return to the estate, not because she wanted closure, but because she needed clarity. When she arrived, the sprawling mansion loomed just as imposing as ever, but this time, she walked through the grand doors with a sense of purpose. Thomas was waiting in the sitting room, standing by the fireplace with his hands clasped tightly in front of him. "Rachel," he began, his voice soft but steady. "Thank you for coming back." She held up her hand, cutting him off. "Before you say anything, I need answers. Real ones this time." He nodded, gesturing for her to sit, but she remained standing. "You owe me the truth, Thomas. No more half-answers, no more deflections. Why did you choose me?" He sighed, his shoulders sagging as if the weight of the question threatened to crush him. "At first, it was simple. I needed someone untouched by my world, someone who wouldn't be swayed by money or power. You were an easy choice because you seemed grounded, honest." Her jaw tightened, but she stayed silent. "But," he continued, his voice gaining strength, "as time went on, it became more than that. You challenged me. You showed me a life beyond boardrooms and contracts. I didn't just need you for the plan, I wanted you for me." Rachel's chest ached at the rawness of his confession. She studied his face, searching for any sign of manipulation, but all she saw was a man stripped of his pretenses. "I don't know if I can trust you again," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I understand," he said. "And I won't ask you to forgive me right away. All I can do is show you that I'm willing to earn it." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Rachel said, "I need time. If we, are going to work, I need to rebuild that trust on my terms." Thomas nodded, relief softening the hard lines of his face. "Take all the time you need." Over the following months, their relationship shifted. Rachel didn't move back to the estate but agreed to see Thomas occasionally, always on neutral ground. He never pushed her, allowing her the space to heal and decide what she wanted. In the meantime, Thomas made changes of his own. He began disentangling himself from the shady dealings that had once defined his business empire, redirecting his resources toward more ethical ventures. He supported local charities, funding scholarships for young women pursuing their dreams, a quiet nod to Rachel's unfulfilled ambitions. One afternoon, Rachel received a package at her parents' house. Inside was a simple leather-bound cookbook and a note, "For the restaurant, I know you'll open one day. You taught me how to hope again. Let me return the favor. Thomas." Tears filled her eyes as she traced her fingers over the pages. It wasn't grand gestures or elaborate apologies that won her over, it was this, the small but meaningful ways he showed her that he believed in her. A year after she had first walked out, Rachel found herself standing outside the estate once more. This time, her heart felt lighter. She knocked on the door, and when Thomas opened it, the surprise on his face quickly gave way to hope. "I'm not here to move back," she said, smiling faintly. "Not yet, anyway. But I'm ready to take another step forward. Together." Thomas's eyes shone with emotion as he nodded. "That's all I could ever ask for." For the first time, Rachel felt like the chaos of the past year had finally settled, paving the way for a future built on trust, understanding, and something she never thought she'd find with him, love.